Before Karen Rowland found herself basking under the Palm Springs sun, her life had already been a tapestry of resilience and reinvention. Years before she ever considered returning to detective work, Karen had faced one of the most challenging periods of her life. The accident that claimed her right leg had not only left physical scars, but also emotional ones that lingered long after the surgeries were over back then. The bustling streets of New York had been both a source of comfort and a painful reminder of the life she had to leave behind. Selling her stake in the New York detective agency felt like closing the door on a part of herself, a part that thrived on solving mysteries and bringing justice to those who couldn't find it on their own. Moving to Portland had been Bill's idea, a chance for a fresh start. But for Karen, it was also an escape from the ghosts of her past cases and the relentless pace of the city that never slept. Yet Portland brought its own set of challenges and unexpected joys. The transition from the vibrant chaos of New York to the quieter, rain-soaked streets of Portland wasn't seamless. Karen struggled to find her footing, both literally and figuratively. But amidst the struggle, there were moments of clarity. She discovered a new rhythm in the Pacific Northwest's laid-back lifestyle, found solace in the close-knit community, and even learned to appreciate the slow, deliberate drizzle. That seemed to wash away the remnants of her former life. It was during these years that Karen began volunteering at a local support group for amputees, where her story of loss and perseverance inspired others facing similar battles. This period of reflection and healing laid the groundwork for her eventual return to detective work, reigniting the fire within her that had never truly been extinguished. So as she reclined by the pool in Palm Springs, the warmth of the sun on her skin felt like more than just a vacation. It was a testament to how far she had come. Karen Rowland drifted into a light nap on her lounge chair, her paperback mystery slipping from her fingers. The desert heat felt comforting until a shadow fell across her. She blinked awake, annoyed. "You're blocking my sun," she muttered, eyes narrowing. When Karen pushed up her sunglasses, she spotted her husband, Bill, grinning, as he handed her an icy daiquiri. "Figured you might need a top-up," he said, with a playful glint in his eye. Karen took the glass, smirking. "Trying to get me tipsy?" Bill chuckled. "Nah, just loosening you up a bit." She raised an eyebrow, her tone teasing. "Oh, really?" And then, "What?" He leaned in slightly, his grin widening. "Then I'd take you upstairs and wear you out." Karen laughed, shaking her head. "Like I've ever needed booze for that." It was only the second day of their Palm Springs vacation, and they were soaking up every bit of sunshine after enduring Portland's harshest winter in years. The break from the gloom had been long overdue. Bill settled into the chair beside her, cracking open a beer, his eyes drifting over to her. He stared for a moment longer than usual. Karen noticed. "What now?" she asked, glancing over at him. A slow smile spread across his face. "Didn't expect to see you rocking such a tiny bikini." "Hey, not my fault. I look this good," she smirked. "Can't believe I let you talk me into it, though. I'm 48, a mom of 2. Hannah's 20 next month." "You still look incredible," he said, his voice soft. She'd chosen a quiet corner by the pool, hesitant about her appearance. Her right leg ended above the knee, and the left bore scars from an old accident. But here she was, showing more skin than she had in years. Karen took a sip of her drink and turned to him. "I've been thinking once Anthony graduates next year, I don't want to just sit around. I'm considering renting office space downtown, getting back into detective work. You're still years from retirement, and I need to keep busy." Bill wasn't surprised. He'd seen how much energy she had when working a case. Honestly, he was shocked she'd stayed away this long after selling her share in the New York detective agency. Moving to Portland had been an adjustment, but it was clear she was ready to get back into the field. Karen waited, recognizing that Bill's silence meant he was still processing what she'd said. Finally, she broke the quiet. I hate meeting clients at coffee shops, and our home office doesn't cut it anymore. I found a place in the Pearl District, $750 a month. COVID hit landlords hard, so it's a steal. What do you think? Bill's lips curved into a smile. That's close to my office. Sounds like a good deal. Are you planning to hire help? Not yet, Karen replied, shaking her head. I'll build things up first. Besides, advertising's way easier now. I don't have to rely on the yellow pages. They continued, chatting, the conversation flowing easily until their drinks were finished. As Bill set his glass down, Karen shot him a sly look. Let's head back to the room, she murmured. Bill didn't need more convincing. He grabbed their stuff while she moved ahead on crutches. Her prosthetics stayed in the room since the resort's. Saltwater pool wasn't friendly to it. He caught up, admiring her confidence. An hour later, Bill lay on the bed staring at the ceiling with a satisfied grin. Karen was curled up against him, her breathing soft and slow. Even after all these years, moments like this felt fresh, special. How did I get this lucky? His mind drifted to when they first met. Karen, 6 months pregnant, had tripped on subway, stairs, and literally fallen into his life. Her brief fling with Hannah's father, Hank Price, had fizzled out before she realized she was expecting. Hank, a federal agent, got reassigned overseas but agreed to support the baby. But Bill? He bought her coffee after that subway mishap, and the rest was history. A few dates in, he was smitten. With Hank's blessing, he adopted Hannah when she was 3 months old just after marrying Karen. Now, 19 years later, Hannah was finishing her first year at Oregon State, and Anthony was prepping for high school graduation. Soon, it would just be the two of them. Bill smiled, picturing slow mornings with Karen. No interruptions, no rush. That thought lulled him to sleep. That evening, the resort's Italian restaurant buzzed with conversation. Karen wore tailored pants and a sleeveless blouse. Skirts were off limits unless she could pair them with thick leggings to cover her prosthetic and scars. But tonight was too warm for that. They were seated near a table where a drunk woman grew louder by the minute. Bill considered asking to move, but decided she'd probably leave soon. He'd regret that later. They had just placed their orders when it happened. The woman, her words slurred from too many drinks, blurted out, "Did you see that MILF by the pool? Damn, cover those legs." Her companion's face went pale. "Joyce, stop," she hissed, glancing nervously around. Joyce just laughed louder this time. "What? It's not my fault. Her stump's gross, Joyce." Her friend's voice dropped, firm and cold. "Shut it at a nearby table." The men turned at the commotion. Their eyes landed on Karen, standing just a few feet away, frozen in place. One of the men shot to his feet, his expression darkening as he grabbed Joyce's arm. "Jim Maggie," he barked over his shoulder. "Get her out of here. I need to apologize." The couple hustled Joyce outside while the man turned back, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said quietly. "There's no excuse. I just want you to know I'm sorry." He hesitated, clearly pained by Karen's expression, then left. Karen slipped her hand into Bill's. "I can't eat. Can you cancel dinner?" Bill saw her holding back tears. Just yesterday, he'd encouraged her to ignore the stares. Today had been a milestone. She swam, wore that bikini, felt like herself again. And now this. Bill flagged the waiter and canceled their order. The waiter, who'd seen it all, nodded sympathetically. "I'm really sorry, folks. I hope the rest of your evening goes better," he said softly. Bill and Karen entered their room quietly. The moment the door clicked shut, Karen sank onto the bed, tears spilling down her cheeks. In all their 20 years together, Bill could count on one hand the times he'd seen her cry. He sat beside her, pulling her gently into his arms without saying a word. After a while, Karen wiped her face and let out a dry laugh. Did I ever mention I was voted best legs in high school? God, I had amazing legs. Bill gave a faint smile. He'd heard that story before Karen's mother had told him while they waited in the hospital during her amputation. When her tears faded, Bill softly suggested, "How about some fresh air?" Karen nodded, and they wandered along a quiet path through the resort. They eventually settled on a bench by the golf course, the desert night warm around them, stars bright overhead. "I'm overreacting, aren't I?" Karen murmured. Bill chuckled. "You overreacting? I married one of the toughest women I know," she smirked. "So my legs didn't win you over?" "Nope, it was your fire." Karen laughed, shaking her head. "Fire. That was me, overheated and pregnant on a subway, about to faint." She squeezed his hand, her voice softening. "I'm not letting some drunk ruin our vacation. Let's grab a drink and maybe a snack. I'm not hungry enough for a full meal, but I need something." They headed back to the bar, feeling lighter than when they left. They just sat down when the assistant manager approached. "There you are, Mrs. Rowland," he said, slightly winded. "I knocked earlier but saw you here. Mr. Tinsdale asked me to give you this note and let you know your entire stay, including food and drinks, has been covered." Bill raised a brow. "The Tinsdales already left." "Yes, sir. Everything's settled." He handed Karen the note and walked off. Karen unfolded the letter and read aloud. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Rowland, I wanted to personally apologize for my wife's appalling behavior tonight. Unfortunately, I'm not surprised. To be blunt, Mrs. Tinsdale is selfish and cruel. This trip was her idea. But tonight only confirmed why we're headed for divorce. I've had enough, and so have our friends. Please know her words don't reflect how most people think. I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay. As a small gesture, your room and all expenses have been covered. Sincerely, Simon Tinsdale." Karen handed the letter to Bill. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. The next few days weren't perfect, but they managed to relax and enjoy their time. They returned to Portland, tanned, rested, and more at peace than they'd been in months. 4 months later, Karen sat at her desk, cursing at her computer. Whoever said QuickBooks was simple clearly never met her, she muttered under her breath. Frustrated at her lack of tech skills, without Anthony's help, she'd be lost. She decided to let him handle the bookkeeping over the weekend. For now, unpaid invoices could wait. The fact that there were invoices to send felt like a win. 3 months after restarting Rowland investigations, business was booming. She was covering rent, expenses, and even saving a little for retirement. Her friend, Captain Glenn Hutchins from the Portland Police, had sent a steady stream of clients. After her success with the Miller homicide case, referrals kept coming. Last month, she'd tracked down a 15-year-old runaway hiding in the mountains with a 25-year-old dependent. The girl's parents were relieved, though Karen knew recovery wouldn't be easy. The teen showed signs of Stockholm Syndrome and would need months of therapy. In the meantime, routine background checks for corporate clients kept the bills paid. If business continued to grow, Karen might even hire part-time help. Not a bad problem to have, she thought, grabbing her purse to head out for lunch. But just as she reached the door, the phone rang. She sighed, turning back. "Rowland Investigations. This is Karen." A man's voice came through the line, steady but tense. "Good morning, Miss Rowland. My name is Larry Parker. I need help with a paternity issue. Can we meet?" Karen quickly checked her calendar. "I'm available tomorrow at 9 a.m. Does that work for you?" "I'll be there. The address on your website, correct?" "Yes," she confirmed. "When you arrive, dial 25 on the intercom and I'll buzz you in." After hanging up, Karen spent the rest of the afternoon organizing files and preparing for whatever this new case might bring. The next morning, she parked a few blocks from her office, the early chill of the day nipping at her skin. As usual, Randall was camped near the entrance, his sleeping bag rolled tight and his backpack stacked neatly beside him. "Morning, Karen," he greeted with a warm nod. "Morning, Randall," she replied, fishing out her keys. He stepped aside as she approached the door. "Am I the first one here?" she asked, sliding the key into the lock. Randall shook his head, stuffing his sleeping bag into one of his backpacks. "Nope. Mr. Nesbitt came by earlier, said I could stay until now." Karen glanced at him, concern flickering across her face. "Any trouble last night?" "None," Randall said with a grin. "Everyone knows this spot's mine." Randall was one of many homeless people in Portland. When Karen first rented the office, several men competed for the spot. One had been aggressive, refused to move when tenants arrived and left messes inside. Calling the cops hadn't helped, so Karen struck a deal with Randall, the politest and conveniently the biggest of the bunch. She paid him $150, $0 a month to keep the doorway clean and clear. Other tenants appreciated the arrangement and pitched in too. Karen had just poured herself a cup of coffee when the intercom buzzed 12 minutes early. She let Larry Parker in, thinking, well, someone's eager. Parker sat across from her, gripping a coffee cup. He was the kind of man you wouldn't notice in a crowd. Average height, plain brown hair, unremarkable brown eyes. But his story was anything but ordinary. Karen began taking notes as he spoke. 10 years ago, I met Julie, my wife. Well, ex-wife. She passed 4 months ago from an undiagnosed heart defect. She was only 29. His voice cracked, but when Karen slid a box of tissues his way, he waved it off and pressed on. I met Julie when she was waitressing at this diner I used to go to all the time, Larry Parker began, his eyes fixed on the table. No ring on her finger. So I asked her out. By our second date, she told me she had a 1-year-old son, Gunnar. She was only 19, but I didn't care. I met him the next day. Sweetest kid you'd ever seen. Always smiling. People thought I was crazy for sticking around, but I was 22 and head over heels. He paused, taking a slow sip from his coffee across the desk. Karen's thoughts drifted to Bill, who had adopted her daughter Hannah without hesitation. At the same age? Parker cleared his throat and continued. Julie didn't talk much about her past. Said she grew up in Ohio, lost both parents when she was young, claimed Gunnar's father bailed when she got pregnant. I didn't ask questions. I love them both. He let out a quiet breath. A year later, we got married. Julie earned her GED and landed a receptionist job. I graduated from the University of Portland and got a remote gig with Nike. I adopted Gunnar within that first year. He's my son. Parker's expression darkened, his voice tightening. Then 4 months ago, Julie's heart gave out. Gunnar and I have been managing, but 3 weeks ago I got a subpoena for Gunnar's DNA. Some guy, George Westfall, claims he's the biological father. He surfaced out of nowhere and got a court order. The test confirmed it. Now he's after custody. Karen looked up from her notes, her brow furrowed. Any idea why Westfall showed up now? Parker let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. I think it's on me. While going through Julie's stuff, I found this old letter she'd written before we met. It mentioned a friend from Ohio she'd stayed with in Indiana. I didn't think much of it. But I found that friend, Chrissy Walker, on Facebook and messaged her to let her know Julie had passed. I mentioned Gunnar. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. Next thing I know, some woman from Dayton calls asking about Gunnar. I got a bad feeling and hung up. A week later, the subpoena arrived. Leaning back in his chair, Parker exhaled sharply. It's a damn mess. Karen closed her notebook and met his eyes. What do you need from me, Mr. Parker? I want to keep my son, he said firmly. I've raised him since he was 1. I don't care who this Westfall guy is, Julie told me. He ran off. I need you to find out who he is, where he's been, and why he suddenly wants Gunnar. I need something to stop the court from taking my son. Karen nodded thoughtfully. I can do that, but I won't lie. It might get expensive. I may need to travel to Ohio. That's fine, Parker replied without hesitation. Julie had life insurance. Most of it's for Gunner, but I've got enough set aside. Just do whatever it takes. Do you have a lawyer handling the custody case? Yeah, he said, leaning forward slightly. John Brown from Braun and Curtis. He's the one who recommended you. When's the hearing scheduled? Parker exhaled. It was supposed to be in 2 weeks, but John filed for a delay. He thinks we can push it back. Good, Karen said, reaching for a blank form from her desk. That'll give me time to dig into this. She slid the paper across to him. I'll need some details to get started. First, Chrissy Walker's contact information. Parker pulled out his phone and began typing in the names and numbers. And the woman who called you, do you have her info? Karen asked, glancing up from her notes. He scribbled on a notepad and slid it across the desk. Janice Clarkson, Dayton, 937-555-2424. Karen scanned the name, then looked back at him. And anything you have on Gunner's biological father? Parker handed over legal documents from his bag. That's all I've got. Karen skimmed through them. This will do for now. She pulled out a contract. Sign this, and I'll need a check for the retainer. Parker signed, slid the check across the desk, and gave a faint smile. John said you were the best. Let's hope he's right. Over the next 2 days, Karen chased down every lead she could find. But George Westfall was like a ghost. No digital footprint, no paper trail. Frustrated, she finally picked up the phone and called Parker. When he answered, she got straight to the point. Larry, have you ever met Westfall in person? No, Parker replied, his voice tight with frustration at the meeting with the lawyer. He wasn't there. His attorney said he was traveling and gave him power of attorney. Why? Karen jotted a note in the margin of her notebook. Just need a description. For my records. I'll be in touch. She hung up before he could ask more. Next, Karen called John Brown. John, where was Westfall's DNA sample taken? After a brief pause, John replied. At a clinic in Tempe, AZ, Karen contacted the clinic, but they refused to release any information without a court order. She called John back to start the process. While John worked on that, Karen reached out to Chrissy Walker in Toledo. After a brief introduction, Chrissy wasted no time diving into details Karen hadn't anticipated. When Larry messaged me about Julie, Chrissy began, her voice tinged with surprise. I called my mom. She still lives next door to Julie's stepmom. Turns out Julie's dad isn't dead like she claimed. He's living in a trailer park outside Tampa. Karen's pen paused mid-sentence. That's unexpected, Chrissy continued, lowering her voice slightly. She also had a half-brother. Real creep. None of us were allowed to sleep over when he was around. He was a few years older than Julie, joined the army, but he still came back to visit on holidays. My mom hasn't seen him in over a year. Karen straightened in her chair. Does your mom have Julie's dad's address? Probably, Chrissy replied. I'll check and get back to you. Karen's curiosity deepened. Do you know why Julie left Ohio all those years ago? No one really knows, Chrissy admitted. We were halfway through senior year when she just vanished. I got one letter from her in Indiana, but after I wrote back, I never heard from her again. My last letter came back undelivered. Karen made a mental note to ask Parker for that letter. Might be something there. She refocused on Chrissy's last comment. Do you remember your stepbrother's last name? Clark, with any, Chrissy clarified. Got it, Karen said, jotting it down. Send me Julie's dad's address as soon as you have it. Will do, Chrissy promised, before the line went dead. About 15 minutes later, Chrissy called back with Samuel Jenkins's address at a trailer park near Tampa, along with his phone number. Karen didn't waste a second. She dialed immediately. Hello. Is this Samuel Jenkins? My name is Karen Rowland. I'm a private investigator and I have some information concerning your daughter, Julie. Would you be willing to meet in person to discuss it? There was a long pause on the line, then his voice came back, tight and suspicious. "Where's Julie?" Karen's gut twisted. He didn't know. He had no clue his daughter had passed, and maybe not even that she'd had a child. "Mr. Jenkins, I really think it would be best if we spoke face to face. Could we meet this Saturday? You can't just tell me now?" His tone sharpened. "I'm afraid this isn't the kind of news I'd want to deliver over the phone." There was silence on the other end, then a reluctant sigh. "All right, I'll be around all day, but why wait till Saturday? I'll confirm the time once I land in Tampa," Karen replied, her voice calm. Jenkins was still trying to push for more answers when Karen gently ended the call. "I'll explain everything when we meet." "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins." She hung up, booked a flight, and rang Larry Parker to ask for Julie's old letter. After a layover in Dallas, she arrived late Friday night. Once settled in her hotel room, she called Bill to let him know she'd made it safely. After exchanging quick "I love yous," she stretched out on the bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Karen called Jenkins to confirm the meeting. He insisted she come by right away. Using GPS, she found his trailer within an hour. Before she even turned off the ignition, the screen door creaked open, and a wiry, gray-haired man stepped outside, scanning the driveway with anxious eyes. Karen got out of the car and approached him. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm Karen Rowland." He hurried toward her, extending a hand, his face lit with cautious hope. But as soon as Karen suggested they head inside to talk, the light in his eyes dimmed. His shoulders sagged, and without a word, he led her into the trailer. "Would you like some coffee?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes, that would be nice." "Thank you." The living room was simple but tidy, with an old couch and family photos lining the walls. Jenkins returned from the kitchen moments later, carrying 2 mugs. "Cream or sugar?" "Black is fine," Karen said, taking the cup. They sat across from each other in the quiet room, the tension hanging heavy between them. Karen took a steadying breath before speaking. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm so sorry to tell you this, but your daughter Julie passed away from a heart condition a few months ago." For a moment, Jenkins just stared at his coffee. His eyes grew glassy and his hands trembled slightly. "Her mother died the same way," he whispered. He was quiet for a long time before finally asking, "Was she happy? What was her life like?" She lived in Portland with her husband, Larry Parker. They seemed like a close, happy couple. She also had a son, Gunnar. He's almost 11 now. Larry adopted him when he was just a baby. Jenkins's brow furrowed. "She never mentioned us, told her husband we were dead." Karen nodded, watching him carefully. "Do you have any idea why she'd say that?" Jenkins let out a heavy sigh and leaned back in his chair. "It was my fault. After her mother passed, I didn't know how to raise Julie on my own. A few years later, I met Janice Clark, a single mom with a teenage son, Jesse. We got married pretty fast. Jesse was a wild one. I tried to lay down some rules, but Janice wasn't having it. His voice grew distant, like he was replaying old memories. I loved Janice too much. I let her take charge of the house while I focused on work, and my relationship with Julie fell apart." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Jesse joined the Army after high school. When he came back to visit, he acted like he'd grown up. Fooled me good. One Christmas, Julie was a senior in high school. Janice and I went to an office party, left the kids home. When we got back, his voice faltered. We found Jesse in Julie's room on top of her." Karen felt a chill creep up her spine. Julie said Jesse's actually exploited her. Jesse claimed she'd seduced him. It was his word against hers. And Janice? She sided with her son immediately, started throwing around accusations about Julie, saying she'd been sleeping around. His voice cracked thick with regret. "And I believed my wife over my own daughter." He stared across the room at a wall of family photos. Julie as a little girl, a teenager, her mother smiling beside her. Jenkins rose from his chair and gently pulled down a picture of young Julie, his fingers trembling as he held it. "This was the last time I saw my little girl," he whispered. A week later, she was gone. The room grew heavy with silence until Karen finally asked, "When did you find out the truth?" Jenkins let out a bitter laugh. "Not soon enough. Jesse went back to Fort Bragg, but less than 2 months later I got a call. A civilian on base accused him of sexually exploitate. Same story, he said, she said, but after that, I couldn't deny it anymore. The Army couldn't charge him, but they discharged him dishonorably." Jenkins rubbed his eyes and took a long breath. "I reached out to Chrissy. Julie's friend asked about those rumors Janice had spread. Chrissy was furious, swore up and down. None of it was true. Said Julie was one of the good ones. He set the photo back on the shelf, his hand lingering on the frame like it could bring Julie back. I wrote her when Chrissy gave me her address in Indiana, but I never got a reply." Then his face brightened suddenly. "You said Julie had a son." Karen nodded. "Do you have a picture of him?" "I'd love to see my grandson." Karen pulled out a photo of Gunnar and handed it over. Jenkins's eyes widened as he stared at the boy's face. His expression shifted from awe to something darker. "Oh my God," he whispered, then louder. "Son of a witch." Karen stiffened. "What's wrong?" "This boy, Gunnar," Jenkins rasped, his face pale. "He looks exactly like Jesse." Karen's heart skipped a beat. "That can't be right. A DNA test confirmed Gunnar's father is a man named George Westfall." Jenkins shook his head, eyes locked on the photo. "I swear on my life. That boy is Jesse's spitting image." Karen's mind raced. "That's why I couldn't find anything on George Westfall. The name was a lie." It all started to make sense. Jenkins snapped her out of her thoughts. "Do you think Larry Parker would let me meet the boy?" "I'll find out," Karen promised. Then she added, "But until I figure out what's going on, I need you to keep this quiet. We need to know why someone posing as Westfall matches Gunnar's DNA." "I won't say a word," Jenkins agreed. "I don't talk to anyone from back home anyway. Just be careful. Chrissy's mom had your number so people can track you down." Jenkins nodded solemnly and Karen left his home. She drove straight to the airport and caught the first flight to Ohio. By Saturday night, Karen checked into a modest hotel just outside Dayton, already planning an unexpected visit to Janice Clarkson the next afternoon. She'd decided a straightforward, no-nonsense approach would be the best way to rattle some answers loose Sunday afternoon. Karen pulled up in front of a weathered craftsman-style house from the 1920s, the peeling paint and overgrown lawns screamed years of neglect. She knocked firmly on the front door, and it creaked open to reveal an older woman, her face etched with deep lines and a permanent scowl. Karen didn't wait for pleasantries. She stepped inside, forcing the woman to backpedal into the living room. "Mrs. Clarkson, I'm here to talk about your son, Jesse. When's the last time you saw him?" The woman blinked, caught off guard by the sudden intrusion. "Who are you?" "What do you want with Jesse?" Karen met her glare without flinching. "I'm a private investigator from Portland. I'm looking into a paternity issue connected to a young boy there. I think you might have some answers." Mrs. Clarkson's confusion shifted quickly to anger. Her eyes narrowed as she spat out. "If some little tramp had Jesse's baby, I deserve to know about it. That boy is my grandson." She had no right to hide him. "From me." Karen pressed harder, watching for any flicker of guilt. "If you're so sure, then why is a man named George Westfall claiming to be the boy's father?" Mrs. Clarkson froze, her face draining of color. She opened her mouth to respond, but before a word escaped, a man's voice bellowed from somewhere deeper in the house. "Janice, who's at the door? Get in here." Without another glance at Karen, Mrs. Clarkson rushed toward the voice, leaving Karen alone in the dimly lit room. The muffled sounds of an argument erupted from the back, voices sharp and rising, though Karen couldn't make out the words. Seizing the moment, Karen quickly scanned the living room. Family photos cluttered the mantelpiece, some dusty and askew. She discreetly snapped a picture with her phone. In one photo, a young boy, clearly Jesse, bore a striking resemblance to Gunnar. Karen's gut told her she was closer to the truth than ever. By the time Mrs. Clarkson returned, her face was flushed, her jaw tight with frustration. "My husband says I don't have to answer your questions," she snapped. "So you're not going to tell me where Jesse is, or why this George Westfall is claiming to be the boy's father?" I can't," Mrs. Clarkson stammered, her bravado fading fast. "Now get out of my house." Karen walked toward the door but paused just before stepping outside. She turned back, her voice low and calm. "I think you'll regret not talking to me." Mrs. Clarkson's face twisted in fury. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Get out or I'll call the cops." Unfazed, Karen slipped out the door without another word, her mind racing. Later that evening, Karen boarded a flight from Dayton to O'Hare, facing a 2-hour layover before catching her plane back to Portland. Exhaustion gnawed at her, but the adrenaline from the encounter kept her alert. The night before, she'd tried digging up information on Jesse Clark using the hotel's weak Wi-Fi, but it was as if the man had vanished off the face of the earth. Monday morning, she'd need to call in some favors. Someone like Jesse had to leave. A trail somewhere. Just as she was closing her notebook after jotting down some notes, a short, stocky man approached her. "Miss Karen Rowland?" he asked. Karen's eyes flicked up, cautious. The man flashed a badge. It was from the U.S. Marshals. He handed her a business card. "Fred Cummins, U.S. Marshals. Mind if I sit?" Karen eyed the badge and ID before nodding to the empty seat across from her. "We know you've been in contact with Samuel Jenkins and Janice Clarkson about Jesse Clark," Cummins said. "Mind telling me why?" Karen, no stranger to law enforcement tactics, met his gaze evenly. Her voice was steady. "I'm investigating a paternity case involving someone named George Westfall, but I'm guessing you already know that's not his real name." Cummins let out a dry chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "You're good. Yeah, we know Westfall is Jesse Clark." Karen allowed herself a tight smile. "Figured as much. So you want to tell me why a man like Jesse Clark is in witness protection?" Cummins' grin faded. "I can't give you all the details, but he helped a district attorney down in South Florida take down a major cartel. That DA is riding, high off the arrests, thinking about a run for governor, maybe senator. Protecting Clark is part of keeping that success story intact." Karen's expression darkened. "So you're protecting a man who sexually exploited his teenage sister, attacked another woman at Fort Bragg, and got tangled up with pill traffickers, and now he's trying to take a kid away from the only father he's ever known." Cummins' jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Clark doesn't give a damn about the kid. His mother does. Once Clark Westfall gets custody, that boy's going straight to her." Karen stared at him, incredulous. "You've got to be kidding. Have you met that woman?" Cummins shook his head. "No, and I'm not eager to. Look, people in WITSEC, they're not all heroes. Sometimes they're just the ones who cut the best deals to avoid prison. Clark's one of those. So what exactly are you expecting from me?" Karen asked, her voice low. "You want me to tell my client to roll over and hand his son over to this garbage?" Cummins' voice dropped, his tone quieter. "Now, off the record, I think Jesse Clark belongs behind bars, not under protection, but my hands are tied. I'm telling you this because I know you'll handle it right. And for what it's worth, there are people in Bogota who'd love to find Clark, not just because he snitched, but because he stole from them." Just as Cummins finished speaking, Karen's flight was announced. He stood up, slipping his badge back into his pocket. "Good luck, Miss Rowland, and thanks for hearing me out." Without waiting for a response, he melted into the crowd. By 9 p.m., Karen's flight touched down at Portland International. She was bone-tired, but knowing Bill would be waiting for her at the curb gave her a sense of relief. She was grateful he'd insisted on handling her airport pickups. As she cleared security and stepped into the arrivals area, she spotted Bill immediately. He stood there, holding a bouquet of flowers, his face lighting up when he saw her. Maybe it was the exhaustion, but Karen felt her eyes sting with tears as a smile crept across her face. Bill pulled her into a firm hug. "Welcome home, babe." Karen kissed him softly, taking the flowers from his hand. "It's only been 3 days, Bill. What's with the flowers?" He chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. 3 long days. "I knew you were dealing with a lot. I just wanted you to know you were missed." Karen laughed quietly. "You don't even know the half of it. Wait till I tell you what happened in Chicago." She'd already shared her theory with Bill that George Westfall was really Jesse Clark, and Jesse had sexually exploited his own sister. But now the situation was even more complicated. On the drive home, Karen filled him in on everything that had happened in Dayton and at O'Hare. Bill listened carefully, his grip on the steering wheel tightening as the details piled up. When she finally finished, he asked the question that had been circling in her mind all evening. "So, what's your next move?" Karen sighed, leaning her head against the car window. "I don't know. I'm walking a tightrope here between the Colombians, a power-hungry DA, and this dirtbag and wit SEC. There's a lot that could go wrong. I just hope Larry and Gunner don't get caught in the middle." The moment Karen stepped through the front door, the weight of the past few days finally began to lift. The familiar scent of home and the sight of Anthony greeting her with a warm hug was exactly what she needed. "Hey, Mom," he grinned. For the next 15 minutes, Karen let herself unwind, listening to Anthony's weekend stories and his latest escapades with the girl he was seeing. It was the perfect distraction from the chaos still swirling in her mind. After a long, steamy shower, Karen changed into her favorite cozy clothes and padded downstairs. Bill was waiting in his office with a glass of wine. Knowing better than to dive straight into the heavy stuff, Karen needed a mental break if she was going to sleep that night. Within minutes, Bill had her laughing so hard, her sides hurt, spinning tales about their quirky neighbors. "This place is like living in a sitcom," he chuckled. Tom Taylor spent his entire Saturday spray painting patio furniture in his garage. Didn't notice the wind was blowing the paint right onto Amy's brand new Mercedes. Karen nearly choked on her wine. "You're kidding. The Benz she just bought." "Oh yeah," Bill grinned. "I was outside digging up that bush you wanted gone when I heard her scream. Ran over just in time to see her snatch the spray can from Tom and douse his shirt with it." Karen was howling. What did Tom do? Ripped off his shirt, grabbed Amy, and hauled her inside, yelling that he'd repaint the car. Karen shook her head, laughing even harder. "Those two are insatiable. I swear everything turns them on." "They've only been married a year," Bill said with a smirk. "Let's see if that energy survives after they have kids." Karen shot him a playful look. "Didn't slow you down, Mr. Rowland." "That's because I married you," Bill shot back. Karen laughed, then hopped on her good leg over to Bill, dropping onto his lap. They were in the middle of a kiss when Anthony poked his head into the room. "Hey, lovebirds, do me a favor and keep it down tonight, will you?" Bill grinned mischievously. No promises. He scooped Karen into his arms and carried her upstairs, both of them still laughing. That night, life felt good. But 1,000 miles south, while Bill had been waiting for Karen at the airport, Jesse Clark was slamming down his phone after another explosive call with his mother. For half an hour, she'd alternated between sobbing and screaming about the grandson she claimed had been stolen from her. "Do whatever it takes to get that boy into my care," she shrieked. "Ma, I'm working on it," Jesse snapped. "But I've got to be careful. The feds are still looking for Jesse Clark, and if they figure out Westfall is me, I'm screwed. If anyone connects the dots, I'm dead." Well, that nosy detective must have figured something out. Why else would she show up here? "We don't know that yet," Jesse muttered, though a knot twisted in his gut. He knew Karen Rowland suspected more than she was letting on. It was time to take action. By Monday morning, Jesse had found Karen's agency online. The same online presence that helped Rowland investigations flourish made it all too easy for him to track her down. By noon, his flight to Portland was booked. The next day, Karen arrived at her office, feeling the exhaustion still lingering from her trip. Larry Parker was due for a lunchtime meeting to discuss the case. She could have updated him over the phone, but given how messy things had become, not to mention the growing invoice pile, a face-to-face meeting felt more appropriate. Unlocking her office door, Karen spotted Randall across the street, standing outside a grocery store with his hat out for spare change. He waved, and she waved back, neither noticing the large man lingering a few doors down. Minutes later, another tenant entered the building and Jesse slipped in, behind them, claiming he had an appointment with a detective on the second floor. He climbed the stairs, spotting the open door to Rowland Investigations. Karen was at her desk flipping through case files. When Jesse stepped inside, he made sure to loom over her desk, puffing out his chest, radiating menace. Intimidation was his trademark. "You need to back off," Jesse barked, jabbing a finger toward Karen. "Leave my mother alone. Stay out of my business and tell Larry Parker to drop it." But Jesse made one fatal error. He underestimated her. At 5'1" and lean, Karen didn't look particularly threatening, but looks were deceiving. She was a black belt in martial arts and an expert marksman, though you'd never guess it from her calm demeanor. Before Jesse could blink, Karen grabbed his outstretched finger, twisted it sharply toward his wrist, and stopped just short of snapping it. At the same time, she drew a pistol from under her desk and aimed it squarely at his face. "Get the hell out of my office," she growled. Jesse froze, stunned. "This scrawny witch thinks she can boss me around," he thought. No woman orders Jesse Clark around, but the cold steel of the tool made him think twice. He backed out of the office slowly, Karen's weapon tracking his every step. "You'll regret this, Rowland," he hissed, retreating down the hallway. Under his breath, he muttered, "You can't imagine how sorry you'll be, witch." As soon as he disappeared, Karen locked the door, her pulse steady. Despite the encounter, she pulled out a business card and dialed the number without hesitation. Fred. Cummins answered on the first ring. "Cummins, it's Rowland. Your boy just walked into my office and threatened me. Game over. You might want to pass that along." She hung up before he could respond. If he had, it probably would have been something like, "I doubt he'll get the message." Jesse Clark was trouble, and deep down, Cummins probably wished George Westfall would just disappear. But Karen wasn't leaving it there. She picked up the phone and called Hank Price for 20 minutes. She laid everything out. The tangled mess of Jesse's identity, the threats, and how this wasn't just about a custody battle anymore. "I know you've got DEA contacts," she said. "Think you can get me in touch with some people in Colombia?" Normally, Hank would have tried to talk her down, but this was different. No one threatened the mother of his daughter or the wife of his best friend. "I'll make some calls," he said, his voice tight. "But in the meantime, stay sharp." That evening, Karen sat Bill down and told him she needed to head to New York. She laid out everything, the case, the risks, the plan. Bill listened in silence, but she could see his jaw tightening with every detail. Later that night, long after Karen had fallen asleep, Bill lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The knot in his chest wouldn't loosen. Finally, he grabbed his phone and dialed Hank. It was 1 a.m. in New York, but Hank picked up on the first ring. "Yeah." Hank's voice was rough but alert. "It's Bill," he said quietly. "Karen told me what you two are planning. Is she going to be safe?" There was a pause on the other end before Hank responded. "I'll do everything I can." Bill swallowed hard, his voice thick. "I can't lose her, Hank. Does she really have to be there?" "You know how she is," Hank replied gently. You married her. Bill let out a long sigh, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Yeah, I know. She thinks she needs to be there, Hank added. Even if it's just to cover my back, Bill's grip on the phone tightened. I wouldn't let her do this for anyone else, Hank. I know, Hank said softly. That's why I won't let anything happen to her. There was a long pause, the unspoken tension hanging in the air. Thanks, man, Bill finally whispered. Good night, Bill. Good night. They both hung up, the heaviness of their words lingering in the quiet. 4 days later, Karen was in New York. She and Hank had arranged a meeting with Carlos Castillo, a man with deep ties to the Colombian cartels. In those 4 days, Hank confirmed Jesse Clark wasn't just hiding because he'd flipped on his old crew. He'd stolen at least $4 million from them, and the Colombians were eager to recover it, offering a generous reward to anyone who helped. The meeting took place in a private hangar at a small airport, a sleek jet. Sat in stark contrast to the 7 folding chairs arranged in a circle on the concrete floor. When one of the Colombians approached to search them for weapons, Hank refused. What? You think we're dumb enough to start a shootout here? He said coolly. I see 5 of you. You, keep your weapons and we'll keep ours. The Colombian hesitated, then glanced at a man seated in the circle. A subtle nod gave approval. Hank and Karen joined them. Settling into the cold metal chairs under harsh fluorescent lights, Karen knew better than to challenge the macho dynamic. Here. She let Hank take the lead. In situations like this, playing the game got results. Introductions were made and Hank cut to the chase. If we give you his alias and tell you where to find him, what's the reward? Karen was surprised when a man named Arias, not Castillo, responded. What are you asking for? Arias asked sharply. 10% of whatever you recover, Hank replied smoothly. The room fell silent before Arias sneered. Or we could just torture you until you talk. Save our boss 10%. Hank didn't flinch. That'd be short-sighted. Arias raised an eyebrow, but Hank pressed on, calm and steady. Karen's got NYPD connections. I've got friends at Langley. They know we're here. And some of them would love an excuse to drop a drone on your boss's house in Bogota. Arias paled slightly. He glanced nervously at Castillo, who had been silent until now. Finally, Castillo spoke, saying something in Spanish, to Arias before turning back to Hank. Please excuse my young associate, Castillo said smoothly. He's watched too many of your Hollywood movies. He thinks tough talk earns respect. Hank smiled, recognizing Castillo as the real power in the room. We were all young once, Castillo chuckled. Yes, but he's learning. Turning back to Hank, Castillo asked, Do you think 5% is fair? There will be costs before we recover anything. Hank looked at Karen, who nodded. 5% works. How will payment be made? Hank asked. To an account in the Cayman Islands, Castillo replied. 5% within a month of recovery. Hank didn't need to ask if they could trust Castillo. Despite his criminal background, Castillo was known to keep his word. As they stepped out of the hangar into the cool night air, Karen finally broke the silence. That's dirt money, Hank. Hank shrugged, unfazed. Donate it to charity if it bothers you? Karen shot him a sharp look. How'd you get so cynical? He gave a dry chuckle. Maybe working for the government too long. You know how many politicians get rich in Congress? You think that money's clean? Karen shook her head, a wry smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. You're cynical. And you're not? Her smile faded. I'm not losing sleep over Clark, she said flatly. One less rapist in the world. Hank glanced over at her, eyebrows raised. Now that's cynical. They lapsed into a comfortable silence as the city lights of Manhattan approached, the hum of the road filling the space between them. After a while, Hank broke the quiet. When the money comes in, give me a third. Keep the rest. Karen frowned, her eyes still on the road ahead. I was going to split it 50-50. I know, Hank replied, but you earned it. Karen let out a short laugh, shaking her head. You know I can't bring that money into the States, right? So spend it in the Caribbean, Hank said. Take Bill on some tropical vacations, escape those Portland winters. Karen smiled, but shook her head. Let's see how this plays out first. A week passed without any updates. Karen did her best to keep Larry Parker calm, offering reassurances she wasn't sure she could back up. With the paternity and custody hearing just 2 weeks away, Larry's anxiety grew, and if Karen was honest, so did hers on a great Portland morning. Bill pulled up in front of Karen's office and dropped her off. She immediately noticed something odd. Randall wasn't at the door. He occasionally spent nights in his girlfriend's tent, but it was also possible another tenant had kicked him to his usual spot. The post-pandemic shift to remote work had left most of the building empty. Only 5 offices were still occupied, and rumors circulated that the top floors would soon be converted into apartments. Karen's mind wandered as she unlocked her office until everything went black. A sharp, searing pain shot through her body as electricity surged through her. Her mind exploded in white-hot agony before everything faded into darkness. When Karen awoke, she was tied to a chair. Her mouth gagged so tightly she could barely make a sound. Her head throbbed, and as her vision cleared, she saw Jesse Clark standing in front of her, a hunting knife glinting in his hand. Awake, Karen. Good girl, Jesse sneered. Time for some fun. Well, for me at least. Karen's heart raced as she noticed the blood on the knife handle. It wasn't hers, Randall. A wave of nausea swept over her. As Jesse lowered the blade from his face to his chest, Karen became acutely aware that she was dressed in only her undergarments. Figured out where we are yet? Jesse taunted. 5th floor of your building, 2 empty floors between us and anyone who might hear you scream? But with that gag, I doubt they'd hear much anyway. I thought about a ball gag, but I'd miss those sweet sounds you'll make. His smile widened as he stepped closer, unfastening his belt with his free hand. Karen's pulse roared in her ears. Think, Karen, think. Before Jesse could take another step, a soft thwip echoed through the room. A dart embedded itself in his neck. What the was all he managed before his hand shot to his neck. His knees buckled and he collapsed. Karen watched in stunned silence as 3 masked men entered her line of sight, grabbed Jesse's unconscious body, and dragged him away. Moments later, Carlos Castillo appeared, holding Karen's blouse in one hand and a knife in the other. Let me get you out of this, he said quietly. Carlos sliced through the plastic straps binding her wrists and removed the gag, handing her the blouse without once glancing at her exposed skin. Karen quickly pulled it on, grateful when he handed her prosthetic leg and trousers. Fausto was watching the building, Carlos explained. He called as soon as Clark showed up. We were monitoring his house in Tempe, your office, and your home. Our plane was waiting in Sacramento, ready to go. As soon as Fausto called, we flew in. Karen nodded, still trying to process everything. I'm okay, just can't believe I let him ambush me. Carlos gave a tight smile. Where we're taking him, it's better you don't know, but I promise he won't bother you or anyone else again. Karen met his gaze. What about Randall? Carlos's face darkened. Fausto didn't have time to stop Clark before he eliminated him. I'm sorry, but if it had gone any further with you, Fausto wouldn't have tolerated it. He was under strict orders to wait. Karen understood. Working under someone like Carlos came with hard decisions. Tell Fausto thank you, Carlos nodded. I need a favor. Wait 3 hours before calling the police about Randall. That's how long it'll take us to clear U.S. airspace. Karen sighed, her heart heavy. I can wait, but I'll probably ask my husband to stay with me today. Think the U.S. Marshals will cause problems? Karen shook her head. I'll be fine. The DA in Florida might throw a fit, but he can shove it. Carlos chuckled. You've got grace, Karen. You remind me of someone I knew long ago. He leaned in, kissed her forehead, and stepped back. "You'll know if the funds hit your account, but I doubt we'll meet again." As Carlos disappeared down the hall, Karen sat for a moment reflecting. Cops and criminals, she thought. She'd respected plenty of people on the wrong side of the law, but wouldn't hesitate to put Carlos behind bars if she had the chance. Karen made her way back to her office, her legs shaky but steady enough. She picked up the phone and dialed. "Bill." "Can you take the afternoon off?" "I need you," she whispered. Bill arrived within minutes. They waited together until 4 hours had passed. Then Karen made an anonymous call to the police to report Randall's body. No one claimed him. And no, official investigation followed. Karen paid for Randall's cremation and scattered his ashes on Mount Hood. He'd often mentioned how much he loved seeing the mountain on clear days. The next morning, Karen met with Larry Parker. "You probably don't need to worry about George Westfall anymore," she told him. "My sources say he's gone for good." When George failed to show up for the custody hearing, Larry was granted permanent custody of Gunner. Janice Clarkson called several times, but Larry made it clear she'd never see the boy. Her attempts to take him had sealed her fate. Samuel Jenkins, Julie's father, was allowed to meet his grandson. He took the train to Portland and stayed for a week. One afternoon, he called Karen for a meeting. "Thank you for softening Larry up," he said quietly. "I know you did it," he told me. "Mr. Jenkins," Karen replied, "you can't spend your whole life beating yourself up over something that happened over a decade ago." "Yes, I can," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Julie was a good girl. She depended on me to protect her. After her mother died, I failed her. I pray heaven exists so Julie can be there with her mom. But me? If there's a hell, that's where I belong." Karen sat in silence for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "Almost every religion believes in forgiveness," she said gently. "Talk to a priest, minister, or rabbi. You need to forgive yourself if you're truly sorry. I didn't know Julie, but from what Larry's told me, she'd want that for you." Jenkins looked up, his eyes glistening. "You remind me of Julie's mother," he whispered. "She always knew the right thing to say, even when it was wishful thinking. I was lost after she died." Karen placed her hand over his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Thank you," Jenkins whispered. He patted her hand, stood, and left the cafe, his shoulders a little lighter. 3 months later, Karen received an email. "Your account has been replenished. Alert." She ran the antivirus and key logging programs Anthony had installed on her computer. Once cleared, she logged into the Cayman account. There it was, $156,000. Without hesitation, Karen transferred 1/3 to Hank's account in Dubai. Another third went to an international charity in Toronto that rescued children from trafficking. She kept the final third, but wasn't sure what she'd do with it yet. A year later, Karen used the money to treat her family and a few close friends to a luxurious week. At a private beach villa on Little Cayman one night, well after midnight, Bill and Karen slipped out to the beach, wearing only robes. The sky was clear, moonless, and awash with stars, except for a dim light near the villa's door. No artificial glow spoiled the view. "I can't believe you talked me into this," Karen whispered, removing her prosthesis and letting her robe fall to the sand. "Come on," Bill whispered back, grinning as he scooped her into his arms. "When else will we get to skinny dip under a sky like this?" Karen didn't answer, but her smile said enough. Bill carried her into the warm, gentle waves. Once waist deep, she floated on her back, gazing up at the infinite stars. Her damp skin shimmered in the starlight, and Bill, treading water beside her, admired the peaceful beauty of the moment. He knew better than to push for more. It wasn't the time, but he was content just to be there with her. Less than 30 meters away, back on the beach, Anthony and his girlfriend Lisa lay quietly on a towel. Though the night was dark as ink, they saw two familiar figures approach the water and drop their robes. "Oh, God," Anthony whispered, realizing who it was. "I think it's sweet," Lisa whispered back, stifling a giggle as Bill carried Karen into the waves. "What if it were your parents?" "Okay, gross, but still kinda cute." Anthony groaned, shaking his head. "I still can't believe they invited you on this trip." "They like me," Lisa said, her voice softening. She hesitated before adding, "Do you think we have a chance to be as happy as they are?" Anthony's heart swelled. "I hope so. I love you." He kissed her deeply, the Caribbean warmth wrapping around them as they clung to each other. In just a month, they'd head off to college. The odds were against them, but some couples beat the odds. As they lay back on the towel, staring up at the endless star-filled sky, everything felt possible.